23 years ago, on this very ground, federal marshals raided the Ritchie farm looking for moonshine that wasn't here. They left without charges, but they left something behind, a dead horse.
The Kentucky Massacre of 1971. Ritchie clan butchered 21 marshals who poisoned their prized workhorse. The bloodiest act of vengeance in Kentucky mountain history and the most devastating campaign of retribution the Cumberland Highlands had ever witnessed from a family whose livelihood had been destroyed through an act of calculated cruelty. This is the true story of the Ritchie clan. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Knott County, Kentucky, in the shadow of the Cumberland Plateau, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely independent corners of the state. The mountains rise here in ancient folds of sandstone and shale, their hollows sheltering families who had carved lives from wilderness and who had defended those lives against all who threatened them. The people who settled these mountains came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit through generations of conflict with authorities who never understood that these hills had their own laws, their own justice, their own ways of handling matters that outsiders had no business involving themselves in. You see, in Knott County in 1971, the bonds of family were sacred above all else. But the bond between a farming family and their work animals was something more, something that the mountain people recognized as essential to survival itself. A family that depended on a draft horse to work their land, to haul their timber, to provide the power that machines could not reach in those steep hollows. That family saw in their animal not mere property, but a partner in the daily struggle for existence. To harm such an animal was to attack the family's ability to survive. The conflict between federal authorities and the mountain communities had been building for decades by the time our story begins. The war on poverty had brought new government programs to the region, but it had also brought new intrusions into the lives of families who had governed themselves for generations. The marshals who enforced federal regulations often came from outside the region, men who viewed the Highland people with contempt and who saw in their poverty an excuse for interference that would never have been tolerated in more prosperous communities. The family who would become known throughout Kentucky simply as the Ritchie clan had lived in the hollows of Knott County for 6 generations, since Jeremiah Ritchie had claimed land along Troublesome Creek in the years after the Revolutionary War. They were a large family, spread across multiple homesteads that dotted the ridges and valleys of the eastern highlands, connected by blood and marriage, and the fierce loyalty that characterized all the old clans. The farming tradition that sustained them had relied on draft horses since the beginning, animals that could navigate the steep terrain where tractors could not operate. That's right, the Ritchie family had been farming with draft horses for nearly 200 years by the time of our story, had developed a dependence on these powerful animals that outsiders could not understand. The steep hillsides they cultivated, the narrow hollows where they harvested timber, the rugged terrain that defined their world, all of these required the strength and sure-footedness that only a good draft horse could provide. Machines had their place in the flatlands, but in the mountains of Knott County, a strong horse was worth more than any tractor ever built. The patriarch of the clan in 1971 was a man named Ezekiel Ritchie, 68 years old, his hair gone white, his face weathered by decades of mountain labor, his hands still strong from a lifetime of work that had never known rest. He was the 6th generation of Ritchie men to farm this land with draft horses, had inherited both the knowledge and the animals that made their operation possible. The respect he commanded within the family was absolute, earned through decades of wisdom and fairness in all his dealings. Ezekiel had 5 sons and 4 daughters, most of them grown and married, most living on family land within a few miles of the main homestead. His sons had sons of their own, young men who were learning the old ways, who would carry the tradition forward into the next generation if the modern world allowed. The extended clan numbered over 50 people when everyone gathered, a network of kinship that provided both support and protection in a world that had never been entirely welcoming. The horse that would become the center of our story was a Belgian draft horse named Atlas, the finest work animal the Ritchie family had ever owned. Atlas was a massive creature, standing 18 hands high, his coat a rich sorrel that gleamed like burnished gold in sunlight, his mane and tail the color of cream, his strength legendary throughout the county. He could pull loads that would have defeated 2 ordinary horses, could work from dawn to dusk without complaint, could navigate terrain so steep that men had to hold onto trees to keep their footing. That's right, Atlas was not merely a horse, but a living tool essential to the Ritchie family's survival. The farm produced barely enough to sustain the extended clan, required constant labor to extract crops from soil that had never been generous. Without Atlas, the steepest fields could not be worked. The timber could not be hauled. The basic operations that kept the family fed could not be performed. He was irreplaceable in the most literal sense. No other horse in the county could match his combination of strength, temperament, and mountain experience. The family had acquired Atlas 12 years before our story begins, had purchased him as a 2-year-old from a breeder in Ohio who specialized in working Belgians. The price had been enormous by their standards, representing several years of careful saving, but the investment had proven sound beyond anyone's expectations. Atlas had become the foundation of their agricultural operation, the power source that made everything else possible, the partner that Ezekiel worked beside every day. The bond between Ezekiel and Atlas had grown over 12 years of shared labor, the kind of connection that develops when man and animal work together day after day, year after year, facing the same challenges and celebrating the same small victories. Ezekiel talked to Atlas as they worked, shared his thoughts with an animal who seemed to understand, trusted the horse with his life on slopes, where a single misstep could send both of them tumbling to their deaths. The horse responded to commands that required no words, anticipated needs before they were expressed, worked with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Now, to understand what happened in the spring of 1971, you need to understand the particular circumstances that had made the Ritchie family targets for federal attention. A new program had been implemented to encourage mountain families to consolidate their scattered landholdings, to sell out to developers who wanted to build vacation properties, or to coal companies that wanted access to mineral rights. The program offered incentives for those who cooperated and created obstacles for those who refused. The Ritchie family had refused. Their land had been in the family for 6 generations, had been cleared and worked and defended by ancestors whose graves dotted the hillsides, had been passed from father to son through nearly 200 years of Kentucky history. No amount of money could compensate for what they would lose by selling. No government program could replace the heritage that the land represented. They made their refusal clear and expected to be left alone. But the federal marshals who administered the program did not accept refusal easily. They had quotas to meet, superiors to satisfy, careers that depended on producing results. A large family like the Ritchies, with extensive landholdings in a prime area, represented exactly the kind of target that could make or break a year's performance numbers. The family's refusal was not accepted as a final answer, but as an obstacle to be overcome. Marshal Vernon Sloan had been assigned to the Knott County District 3 years before, had developed a reputation for producing results regardless of the methods required. He was 42 years old, a career bureaucrat who viewed the mountain people with contempt and who believed that their attachment to land and tradition was mere stubbornness that could be broken with sufficient pressure. He assembled a team of 21 marshals who shared his views, men who were willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve the compliance their program required. And that's when the nightmare began to unfold. You see, the morning of March 15, 1971, had started like any other spring day on the Ritchie homestead. Ezekiel had risen before dawn to feed Atlas, had spent time with the horse as he did every morning, preparing for another day of work on the steep hillside fields that needed plowing before planting season began. The bond between man and animal was visible in every interaction, the trust and affection that had developed over 12 years of partnership. The sound of vehicles announced the arrival of trouble shortly after sunrise. A convoy of federal vehicles came up the narrow road that led to the main homestead, more vehicles than the family had ever seen the government deploy at once. 21 marshals emerged from the cars and trucks, their manner suggesting that they had come for confrontation rather than conversation. Marshal Sloan approached Ezekiel with documents relating to the land consolidation program, demanded once again that the family reconsider their refusal to participate. Ezekiel repeated what he had said before. The land was not for sale, would never be for sale, had been in his family for 6 generations and would remain in his family as long as any Ritchie drew breath. His refusal was polite but absolute, delivered with the quiet dignity that characterized the old mountain men. What happened next would be remembered in Knott County for generations as the most calculated act of cruelty ever committed by federal authorities, a demonstration of what happened when bureaucratic power was wielded without conscience or restraint. Sloan had anticipated the refusal, had come prepared to deliver a message that would change Ezekiel's mind. He ordered his marshals to seize Atlas from the barn, to lead the massive horse to a location visible from the house, to ensure that the entire family could witness what was about to happen. The marshals who hesitated were threatened with consequences for their careers, and one by one they complied. Atlas was led to the center of the farmyard, confused by the rough handling from strangers, but trusting that Ezekiel would soon intervene to restore order. The horse stood patiently, waiting for the situation to make sense, not understanding that sense had departed the moment the federal vehicles had arrived. Sloan produced a bottle containing a clear liquid, announced to the assembled family that this was what happened to people who defied federal programs, who thought they could ignore the government and continue living in the past. He approached Atlas, pried open the horse's mouth, and poured the contents of the bottle down the animal's throat before anyone could intervene. The poison took effect within minutes. Atlas began to stagger, his massive legs no longer responding properly, his eyes showing confusion that slowly turned to pain. He collapsed in the farmyard, his body convulsing, foam forming at his mouth, his breath coming in gasps that grew weaker with each passing moment. The family watched in horror, unable to help, unable to stop what was happening, forced to witness the death of an animal that had been their partner for 12 years. Ezekiel reached Atlas before the end came, fell to his knees beside the dying horse, cradled the massive head in his lap as the animal's life slipped away. The old man's face was a mask of grief and rage, his hands stroking the mane he had brushed 1,000 times, his voice murmuring words that no one else could hear. Atlas died in Ezekiel's arms, his eyes fixed on the face of the man who had loved him, the bond between them unbroken even at the moment of death. The official report filed by Marshal Sloan claimed that the horse had been euthanized due to a contagious disease that threatened other livestock in the area, that the action had been necessary to protect public health, that proper procedures had been followed throughout. The report made no mention of the poison that had been administered as a message, did not acknowledge that the killing had been designed to break the family's will, treated Atlas's death as a routine administrative action rather than calculated murder. But for the Ritchie clan, the matter had only begun. You see, the death of Atlas destroyed something in the Ritchie family that could never be repaired, but it had also awakened something that had lain dormant for generations. The horse had been more than property, more than a tool, more than even a beloved animal. He had been essential to their survival, the power that made their farming operation possible, the partner that enabled them to extract a living from land that would otherwise have defeated them. His death was not merely cruel, but potentially fatal to their way of life. The grief that consumed the clan in the days following Atlas's death was mixed with a cold fury that the mountain people had not felt since the feuding days of their grandparents' generation. They buried Atlas on the ridge above the homestead, dug the grave themselves because they could not bear to have anyone else touch his body, marked the site with a stone that bore only his name and the years of his birth and death. And as the family gathered at that grave, united in their grief and their rage, a decision was made that would define everything that followed. They would kill them. Every marshal who had participated in the poisoning, every man who had seized Atlas or stood watching while he died, every federal officer who had been part of the force that had invaded their land and murdered their livelihood. The clan would hunt them one by one, would find them wherever they went, would ensure that each experienced something of what Atlas had experienced before the end came. 21 marshals had come to their property that morning. 21 marshals would die before the Ritchie clan was finished, and that vow, made in the silence of a hilltop grave, would be fulfilled in ways that no one could have imagined. The planning process took 4 weeks, during which the clan gathered information while appearing to be consumed by grief. The appearance was not entirely false. The grief was real and overwhelming, present in every moment of every day. But beneath the grief was something harder, something that the isolation of the mountains had preserved in families like the Ritchies, something that modern society had forgotten, but that these people had never lost. The clan operated as a unit in ways that federal authorities could not comprehend. There were over 50 adults who could participate in operations, people who knew the land intimately, who could move through the forests and hollows without being seen, who had skills of hunting and tracking that had been passed down through generations. The marshals they were hunting were soft men from cities, men who did not understand the terrain they had entered when they came to the Ritchie property, men who were vulnerable in ways they could not imagine. The method they chose reflected both the crime being avenged and the resources available to mountain families who had lived close to the land for generations. The Ritchies knew plants, knew which ones healed and which ones killed, had preserved knowledge that had come to the mountains with their ancestors and that had been passed down through 6 generations. They would kill the marshals as Atlas had been killed, with poison administered in ways that would be difficult to trace, deaths that would echo the death that had started everything. The first killing came 4 weeks after Atlas's death. The target was Marshal Vernon Sloan himself, the man who had poured the poison down Atlas's throat, whose hand had delivered the death that destroyed the family's livelihood. Sloan was found dead in his home, his body showing signs consistent with poisoning, his face bearing an expression of agony that suggested his death had not been peaceful. The message was unmistakable. The killer had ensured that Sloan experienced something of what Atlas had experienced, had delivered death in a form that echoed the crime being avenged. The killing of Vernon Sloan sent shockwaves through the federal agency. The manner of death, the obvious connection to the horse that had been poisoned, made clear that this was not random violence but targeted revenge. The marshals who had participated in the Atlas killing understood immediately that they were being hunted, that someone was seeking retribution for what had happened at the Ritchie homestead. Fear began to spread through their ranks. The second killing came 2 weeks later, targeting another marshal who had participated in the poisoning. This man had been one of those who had led Atlas from the barn, whose hands had gripped the halter while the horse was positioned for his death. He was found dead in similar circumstances, poisoned with something that had caused convulsions and suffering before the end came. The pattern was unmistakable now. The killer was ensuring that each victim experienced something of what Atlas had experienced. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession, demonstrating that the campaign was accelerating. Both victims were marshals from the Sloan team, both killed by poison in circumstances that required planning and patience. The federal agency began to realize that they faced something unprecedented, a coordinated campaign of vengeance that was systematically eliminating everyone who had participated in the Atlas killing. That's right. The Ritchie clan continued their campaign through the spring and summer of 1971, striking with a regularity that kept their enemies constantly off balance. The fifth marshal died in late April, found in his apartment with the same signs of poisoning that had marked the previous deaths. The poison had been introduced into his food, traceable only to a dinner he had eaten at a restaurant where no one remembered anything unusual about his meal. The sixth was discovered shortly after, killed while traveling for work, his coffee apparently contaminated at a rest stop where he had paused during a long drive. The seventh and eighth deaths came on the same day, in different cities hundreds of miles apart, demonstrating that the clan was operating multiple teams simultaneously or had recruited allies who shared their determination. The sophistication of the poisoning attacks reflected knowledge that had been preserved in mountain communities for generations. The Ritchies knew plants that could kill without leaving obvious traces, compounds that could be introduced into food or drink without detection, methods of delivery that made prevention nearly impossible. Modern forensics struggled to identify the agents being used, toxicology reports coming back inconclusive or pointing to substances that were not commercially available. The herbal knowledge that made their campaign possible had been passed down through 6 generations of Ritchie women, a tradition that had begun with the family's earliest ancestors in Virginia and that had been carefully maintained through centuries of mountain life. The grandmother who had taught Ezekiel's mother had learned from her grandmother who had learned from her grandmother, a chain of transmission stretching back to a time when such knowledge was common rather than rare. The plants they used grew wild in the hollows of Knott County, species that most modern botanists would have dismissed as weeds, but that contained compounds capable of causing death in ways that defied forensic analysis. Some worked quickly, causing convulsions and suffering that echoed what Atlas had experienced. Others worked slowly, their victims declining over days or weeks before the final collapse came. The Ritchies chose their methods based on the circumstances of each killing, demonstrating flexibility that investigators found impossible to predict or counter. The preparation of their compounds required skill that could not be learned from books, timing that had to be perfect, understanding of dosages that varied based on factors that only experience could teach. A plant harvested at the wrong time might be ineffective. A compound prepared incorrectly might cause suspicion before it could kill. The margin for error was non-existent, and the Ritchies made no errors throughout their entire campaign. The terror that began to spread through the remaining marshals was unlike anything the federal agency had experienced. This was not ordinary criminal violence, not the straightforward danger of suspects who might resist arrest. This was something else entirely, a systematic campaign by people who could poison your food without you knowing, who could contaminate your coffee or your water or anything else you consumed, who were patient enough to wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. Each killing was executed with care that reflected the clan's patience and their intimate knowledge of the substances they were using. They followed their prey for days before striking, learned their habits and their vulnerabilities, waited for the perfect moment when poison could be administered without detection. The skills of herbalism that had healed their families for generations were now applied to a deadlier purpose. The 9th killing came as summer reached its peak, targeting one of the marshals who had fled to a distant state seeking safety in distance. The Ritchie clan tracked him there, waited for the opportunity that patience always provided, poisoned him in a manner consistent with the previous deaths. The message was clear. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no safety, anywhere for men who had participated in Atlas's death. The 10th and 11th killings followed in quick succession, each victim found with signs of poisoning that had caused suffering before death came. The 12th came in late summer, the 13th shortly after. The pattern was relentless, the pace steady, the determination absolute. The Ritchie clan was not merely killing men, but delivering a message that everyone in the region understood. What had been done to Atlas would be repaid in kind, measured out one death at a time until the debt was fully paid. The investigation into the killings struggled against an enemy it could not comprehend. Federal investigators were brought in from Washington, experts in domestic terrorism and organized crime, but they found nothing that matched their experience. The Ritchie clan was not an organization they could infiltrate, not a network they could map, not a threat they could counter with conventional methods. They were a family, bound by blood and loyalty that no outside pressure could break. The mountain community provided no assistance to investigators. The people of Knott County understood what had been done at the Ritchie homestead, understood that Atlas's death had been an attack on values they all shared, understood that the clan's revenge was justice for a crime that the official system would never have punished. They refused to provide information, claimed ignorance of everything, created obstacles that investigators found impossible to overcome. The 14th killing came on September 15, 1971, exactly 6 months after Atlas's death. The anniversary timing was deliberate, a message that the clan remembered every detail of what had been done to them and that their campaign was far from finished. The remaining marshals were in a state of constant terror, unable to eat food they had not prepared themselves, unable to drink water they had not drawn from their own taps, unable to trust anyone or anything. The 15th and 16th killings came as autumn arrived, the changing seasons doing nothing to slow the campaign. The 17th death occurred as winter approached, the 18th shortly after. Each victim was found with the same signs of poisoning, the same evidence of suffering that echoed what Atlas had experienced. The toxicology reports grew increasingly desperate, identifying compounds that should not have been possible to obtain, suggesting knowledge of chemistry or herbalism that exceeded anything the investigators had encountered. The 19th marshal died in January 1972, the 20th in February. Both had taken extreme precautions, had hired food tasters, had refused to eat anything they had not watched being prepared. Neither precaution had saved them. The Ritchie clan's patience and knowledge exceeded any defense the Marshals could devise. Their ability to find opportunities that seemed impossible demonstrated with each new death. The 21st and final killing came on March 15, 1972, exactly 1 year after Atlas's death. The victim was the last remaining marshal from the original force of 21, a man who had barricaded himself in a secure facility with armed guards and multiple layers of protection. None of it had been sufficient. He was found dead of poisoning, despite every precaution, his body bearing the same signs of suffering that had marked all his colleagues, the final payment in a debt that had taken exactly 1 year to collect. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the killing stopped. No member of the Ritchie clan was ever arrested for the 21 deaths, never tried, never officially connected to the campaign that had eliminated an entire team of federal marshals over the course of a year. The evidence that might have convicted them was never found. The witnesses who might have testified were either dead or unwilling to speak. The community that had protected them maintained its silence even after the campaign ended. The federal investigation that followed the killings became a case study in the limits of law enforcement against determined rural communities. Investigators documented their frustrations in reports that remained classified for decades, describing an enemy that could not be identified, methods that could not be countered, a wall of silence that could not be penetrated. The Ritchie clan had not merely killed 21 marshals, but had demonstrated the powerlessness of federal authority against a family that refused to submit. But everyone knew. The mountain people knew, the federal government knew, the families of the dead marshals knew. They understood what had happened and why. Understood that 21 men had paid with their lives for the crime of poisoning a draft horse that had been essential to a family's survival. Understood that the Ritchie clan had extracted a justice that the official system would never have provided. The Ritchie clan continued to live in Knott County for decades after the killings ended. Continued to farm their land as their ancestors had done, eventually acquiring another draft horse to replace Atlas, though they never found one that could truly match him. They never spoke of what they had done during that year of vengeance, never acknowledged their role in the deaths that had reshaped federal policy in the region, never showed any sign of guilt or regret for the campaign they had conducted. Ezekiel Ritchie lived for another 12 years after the final killing, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1984 at the age of 81. He was buried on the ridge beside Atlas, the man and the horse reunited in death, their graves marked by simple stones that bore only names and dates. The family gathered for his funeral, as they had gathered for the horse's burial, united in their grief as they had been united in their vengeance. The agricultural operation that Atlas had made possible continued through the acquisition of new horses, though none ever matched his combination of strength and intelligence and trust. The steep fields that he had plowed for 12 years were eventually abandoned as the family found other ways to sustain themselves, the land returning to forest that covered the traces of cultivation that had once marked every hillside. The aftermath of the Ritchie clan's campaign reshaped federal policy in the Kentucky mountains for a generation. No program that followed ever attempted the kind of coercive tactics that had characterized the land consolidation effort, understanding that there were limits to what could be done without consequences, that the isolation of the mountains protected traditions that federal authority could not easily suppress. Congressional hearings were convened in the years that followed, examining how the land consolidation program had gone so wrong, why 21 federal employees had died pursuing bureaucratic objectives. The testimony revealed patterns of abuse that extended far beyond the Ritchie case, documented coercion and intimidation throughout Appalachia by agents who had been given too much power and too little oversight. The hearings produced headlines that damaged federal credibility throughout the region. The investigation's failure became a cautionary tale within federal law enforcement, cited in training programs as an example of what could go wrong when agencies underestimated rural communities. The marshals who had participated in the Atlas killing had viewed the Ritchies as ignorant hillbillies who could be intimidated into compliance. They had been wrong in ways that cost them their lives. The media coverage of the campaign evolved over its course, from initial reporting of mysterious deaths to growing speculation about patterns that seemed too consistent to be coincidental. Journalists who traveled to Knott County, expecting to find backwoods mountain folk instead, encountered a sophisticated community that had preserved knowledge the modern world had forgotten. Some reporters wrote sympathetic pieces that portrayed the Ritchies as victims of federal overreach, though none could openly endorse the violence that had followed. The reforms that followed were significant, though they came too late for Atlas and for the 21 men who had died avenging him. Federal programs in Appalachia were redesigned to emphasize voluntary participation rather than coercion, recognizing that heavy-handed tactics produced resistance that no amount of force could overcome. Training programs for federal agents were revised to include cultural sensitivity components, acknowledging that different communities had different values that deserved respect. The legal framework governing federal operations in rural areas was strengthened, requiring higher levels of approval for actions that might destroy property or livelihoods. The casual cruelty that had characterized Sloan's campaign became explicitly prohibited, though enforcement of such prohibitions would remain inconsistent in practice. The balance of power that had existed before Sloan's campaign was restored, an unspoken understanding that the mountain people would be treated with respect, regardless of whether they chose to participate in government programs. The cultural impact extended beyond Knott County. The Ritchie clan's campaign became a story told throughout eastern Kentucky and beyond, a reminder of what could happen when outsiders pushed too hard against communities that had their own ways of handling matters. The story was passed from generation to generation, modified and embellished as it traveled, becoming part of the folklore of a region that had always valued independence above all else. The gravesite where Ezekiel and Atlas rest together became a place of quiet pilgrimage for those who knew the story, visited by family members and admirers who wanted to pay respects to a man and a horse whose bond had been strong enough to survive death, whose memory had been defended with a ferocity that the modern world could barely comprehend. The stones stand together on the ridge, overlooking the land that the Ritchie family had held for 6 generations, a testament to loyalty that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. The songs that emerged from the Ritchie clan story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, from Atlas's death through the campaign to the final killing. These songs celebrated the clan's determination, described their revenge in terms that bordered on admiration, portrayed them as defenders of a way of life that had been attacked by men who neither understood nor respected it. The first songs appeared within months of the campaign's conclusion, composed by local musicians who understood the power of the narrative. These early ballads spread through eastern Kentucky and beyond, learned by one community and carried to the next, modified and embellished as they traveled. The songs served multiple purposes: entertainment, moral instruction, and preservation of a history that official records treated only as unsolved crimes. One popular ballad described Atlas himself, painting a portrait of a working horse who had labored beside his family for 12 years, whose strength had made their survival possible, whose death had been designed to break their will. The song captured the bond between Ezekiel and Atlas, the 12 years of partnership, the trust that had developed through countless days of shared labor. It portrayed the poisoning in terms that made the cruelty visceral, the horse's confusion and pain, the old man kneeling in the farmyard with his dying partner. The melody was haunting and memorable, built on traditional Appalachian patterns that made it easy to learn and hard to forget. Musicians reported that audiences would fall silent during certain verses, that farmers who had worked with horses their entire lives would weep openly at the description of Atlas's death. The song created a heaviness in the air that lingered long after the final note had faded. The verses describing Atlas's death became iconic, repeated in countless retellings. They captured Marshal Sloan's calculated cruelty, his decision to murder an animal as a message to its owners, his belief that the mountain people could be intimidated into submission. They described Ezekiel's grief as he held Atlas's head, the tears that fell on the horse's mane, the silent vow that formed in the old man's heart. The image became a symbol of what happened when federal authority was exercised without conscience or restraint. Another song told the story from the Marshals' perspective, describing their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one around them, each poisoned in a manner that echoed what they had done to Atlas. This song was darker than most, capturing the psychological horror of enemies who could contaminate anything, who left no traces that forensics could follow, who were patient enough to wait months or years for the perfect opportunity. It described their attempts to protect themselves, their growing paranoia, their final understanding that the Ritchie clan would find a way regardless. The song imagined their final moments, the understanding that came too late, that what they had done was monstrous, the regret that served no purpose when the poison was already working. It offered no sympathy for these men, but rather held them up as examples of what happened when cruelty was answered in kind, when those who destroyed livelihoods found their own lives destroyed. A third song focused on the knowledge that had made the campaign possible, the herbal wisdom that had been preserved in mountain communities for generations, the understanding of plants and their properties that had been passed from mother to daughter, from grandfather to grandson. This song was more mysterious than the others, suggesting powers that the modern world had forgotten, knowledge that could not be learned from books or taught in schools. A fourth song addressed the broader meaning of the events, connecting the Ritchie clan's campaign to traditions of mountain resistance stretching back through centuries. This song was more philosophical than the others, exploring questions about progress and tradition, about who had the right to decide how people should live their lives, about the costs that federal programs imposed on communities they claimed to be helping. The most famous of all the Ritchie clan songs was composed several years after the events by a professional musician who traveled to Knott County to research the story firsthand. This comprehensive ballad told the complete narrative with skill and emotional power, becoming a standard in the folk music repertoire. It has been recorded by numerous artists over the years, carrying the Ritchie story to audiences who never knew them but who recognized in their actions something universal about survival and its defense. Historians who have studied the Ritchie clan case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to federal overreach during the War on Poverty era, arguing that the government's programs, however well-intentioned, often failed to respect the autonomy of communities they claimed to be helping. They note that the land consolidation program had been designed to benefit developers and corporations more than the families it displaced. These scholars have traced the connections between the Ritchie case and broader patterns of conflict between federal authorities and Appalachian communities during the 1960s and 1970s. The War on Poverty had brought unprecedented federal attention to the region, but that attention often took forms that local people experienced as intrusion rather than assistance. Programs designed in Washington by people who had never set foot in the mountains failed to account for local values and traditions. The economic analysis reveals how the land consolidation program benefited corporate interests rather than the families it claimed to serve. Developers and coal companies had lobbied for the program, promising jobs and economic growth that never materialized for the communities being displaced. The marshals who administered the program were, in effect, serving private interests while wearing federal badges, using government authority to achieve goals that had nothing to do with public welfare. Others have focused on the particular bond between farming families and their working animals, examining how draft horses could become essential to survival in ways that modern mechanized agriculture could not understand. Atlas was not merely valuable but irreplaceable, the foundation upon which the entire Ritchie operation depended. His death threatened not just the family's prosperity, but their ability to continue existing on land they had held for 6 generations. Agricultural historians have noted that the Ritchie case occurred at a transitional moment in Appalachian farming, when traditional methods using draft animals were being replaced by mechanization throughout the region. Families like the Ritchies who continued to use horses were doing so not out of ignorance, but out of practical necessity, their steep terrain unsuitable for the tractors that were transforming agriculture elsewhere. The attack on Atlas was thus an attack on one of the last bastions of traditional farming in the region. The ethnobotanical analysis has examined the knowledge that made the clan's campaign possible, the preservation of herbal traditions that included understanding of toxic as well as medicinal plants. Mountain communities had maintained this knowledge for generations, using it primarily for healing, but retaining awareness of its darker applications. The Ritchie clan's ability to poison 21 men without leaving identifiable traces demonstrated mastery of a pharmacological tradition that modern science could not easily replicate. Researchers have attempted to identify the compounds used in the killings, analyzing the limited forensic evidence that remains from the original investigations. The results have been inconclusive, suggesting either that the Ritchies used multiple different agents or that they employed methods of preparation that altered the chemical signatures of known substances. Either possibility demonstrates sophistication that defied the stereotype of ignorant mountain folk that federal agents had brought to their encounter with the clan. The psychological analysis has examined how the clan's response reflected the values of their community, the importance placed on self-reliance and the defense of livelihood in cultures that had maintained their isolation from modern norms. The Ritchie family did not see themselves as murderers, but as defenders of their survival, as people who were responding to an attack that had threatened everything they had built over 6 generations. Sociologists have studied the community response to the campaign, the wall of silence, that prevented any successful prosecution. The people of Knott County demonstrated a solidarity that transcended individual family connections, united in their opposition to federal authority that had demonstrated its contempt for their traditions. The Ritchie clan could not have sustained their campaign for a year without the active support of neighbors who shared their values and their grievances. Legal scholars have noted the impossibility of prosecuting a case against an entire clan, especially when the method of killing left so few traces. The poisonings had been conducted with skill that made forensic analysis nearly useless. The compounds used either unidentifiable or untraceable to any source. Even if investigators had been certain of the clan's guilt, proving it in court would have been essentially impossible. You see, what the Ritchie clan did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. They killed 21 men, each one poisoned in a manner designed to echo the death that had started everything, each death planned and carried out with determination that allowed no mercy. The fact that their victims had participated in Atlas's death does not eliminate the fact that they acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not theirs to take. The moral calculus of their actions has been debated by ethicists and philosophers since the story became widely known. Some argue that the destruction of a family's livelihood, especially through such calculated cruelty, created circumstances in which normal moral rules no longer applied. Others counter that no animal, however valuable or beloved, can justify the taking of human life. The question of proportionality has been particularly contested. One horse, however essential, was the immediate cause of 21 deaths. To those who view animals as property, the response seems wildly disproportionate, a massacre triggered by what should have been a civil matter, resolved through lawsuits and insurance claims. To those who understood what Atlas represented, the proportionality shifts. The horse's death threatened the survival of an entire family on land they had held for 6 generations, and the manner of his death was designed to break their will rather than achieve any legitimate purpose. The families of the Marshals killed present another dimension of the moral complexity. These men had wives and children, parents and siblings, people who grieved their deaths regardless of what they had done. Some of these family members have spoken publicly about their losses, described the terror of that year when their loved ones were being hunted, expressed anger at a system that failed to protect or avenge them. Their grief is real, their loss is genuine. Their voice is a reminder that the Ritchie clan's vengeance created victims beyond those directly responsible for Atlas's death. The distinction between the Marshals themselves has also been raised. Not all 21 men played equal roles in what happened. Sloan had ordered the poisoning and administered it himself. Others had merely stood by, following orders, perhaps troubled by what they witnessed, but not intervening to stop it. Did all of them deserve to die? Did mere presence at the killing condemn everyone equally? These questions have no easy answers. The mountain communities that protected the Ritchie clan made their own judgment, decided that what the clan did was justice rather than murder, refused to cooperate with investigations that might have brought them to trial. Their silence was their verdict, their protection, their endorsement of actions that the official world could only condemn. The religious dimensions have also been debated. The Ritchie family were church-going people, raised in a tradition that taught forgiveness and warned against vengeance. How did they reconcile their faith with the campaign they conducted? Some observers have suggested that mountain Christianity has always had a strain of Old Testament justice, an eye for an eye that coexists uneasily with New Testament mercy. Others argue that the Ritchies simply compartmentalized, separating their religious beliefs from the actions they felt compelled to take. And yet their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. They were a family whose livelihood had been destroyed by men who neither understood nor cared about the consequences of their actions, whose ability to survive on land they had held for 6 generations had been attacked without provocation or justification. What options did they have when the official system protected the killers? Their story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The poisoning of Atlas was legal in the sense that no one was prosecuted for it, that the official system treated it as a legitimate administrative action, but the poisoning was not just. Atlas was an animal essential to his family's survival, murdered as a message by men who had no right to send such messages. The specific circumstances that produced the Ritchie clan story, the combination of federal overreach, the targeting of traditional communities for programs they did not want, the willingness to destroy livelihoods to achieve bureaucratic goals, have not entirely disappeared. Similar conflicts continue to occur throughout rural America, continue to generate resentment that sometimes explodes into violence, continue to raise questions about who has the right to decide how people should live their lives. The descendants of the Ritchie clan still live in those Knott County hollows, still farm their land as their ancestors did, still maintain the traditions that define their family identity. The knowledge that made their campaign possible has been preserved, passed down through generations who understand that some things should never be forgotten. The family gathers regularly at the graves on the ridge, paying respects to the patriarch and the horse, whose bond defined everything that followed. The mountains of eastern Kentucky remain today much as they were in 1971, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollow where Atlas died still holds his descendants, people who know the history and who honor the memory. The steep fields that he once plowed have returned to forest, but the land remains in Ritchie hands, passed from generation to generation as it has been passed for over 200 years. The story of the Ritchie clan endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of livelihood and what people will do to protect it. It is the story of cruelty and the responses it can provoke when wielded by those with power against those without. It is the story of family and the bonds that unite people against all who threaten them. It is the story of knowledge preserved across generations and the terrible uses to which it can be put when circumstances demand. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Ezekiel stood, to see the graves where he and Atlas rest together, to walk the hollow where a horse was poisoned and 21 men died in response? Would you breathe the mountain air, feel the wind that has blown through these ridges for millennia, sense the presence of history that lingers in certain places? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the graves are difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from Lexington takes most of a day, winding through mountains that seem to rise higher with each passing mile. The paved roads give way to gravel, and the gravel gives way to dirt tracks that require careful navigation. Modern vehicles struggle on terrain that horses once crossed easily, and the final miles must often be covered on foot, following paths that only the local people know. The people who live in the surrounding hollows still know the Ritchie story, still speak of Ezekiel and Atlas when strangers ask about the history of the region. They will point the way to the cemetery, will share their own memories or the memories their parents passed down, will help visitors understand the context that makes the story comprehensible. They do not judge the Ritchie clan for what they did, do not condemn them as murderers, see in their actions the response of a family that had been pushed beyond what anyone should be expected to endure. The Ritchie homestead remains occupied by descendants who continue farming the land their ancestors cleared 6 generations ago. Visitors who approach respectfully are sometimes given tours of the property, shown the spot in the farmyard where Atlas fell, walked through fields that the great horse once plowed. The family does not speak of the campaign itself, maintains the silence that has protected them for decades, but their hospitality demonstrates that the Ritchie tradition includes grace as well as determination. The herbal gardens that once supplied the compounds for the campaign have long since been converted to other uses, but the knowledge they represented has not been lost. The women of the family still know which plants heal and which plants kill, still pass this information from mother to daughter, as it has been passed for 6 generations. Whether this knowledge will ever be used again for its darker purposes, no one can say. But its preservation ensures that the option remains available should circumstances require. The gravesite sits on the ridge above the old homestead, overlooking the land that generations of Ritchie men and women have worked and defended. The stones that mark Ezekiel's and Atlas's resting places stand side by side, man and horse together in death, as they were in life. The view from the ridge encompasses miles of mountain country, forests and hollows that have known the Ritchie family since before Kentucky achieved statehood. Standing at those graves, looking out over the land that the family has held for 6 generations, one can almost feel the presence of those who rest there. They are gone, of course, have been gone for years now, but what passed between them remains, preserved in memory and song and story. The questions they force us to ask, about livelihood and its defense, about what any family would do when their survival is attacked, have no easy answers. The farmyard where Atlas died has changed little since 1971, the spot where he fell marked by nothing visible but known to everyone in the family. The barn where he was led by the Marshals still stands, its wooden walls bearing the marks of the decades that have passed since that terrible morning. Some visitors report feeling something in that place, a heaviness that might be imagination or might be something more. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Ezekiel and Atlas close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. Their story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Knott County during that terrible year, as long as families defend their livelihoods with a determination that the modern world can barely comprehend, as long as systems fail and ordinary people find their own extraordinary ways to respond. They are gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the ridge where they lived and where they rest. But what happened between them echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Ritchie clan, who butchered 21 federal marshals after they poisoned the family's prized workhorse Atlas. Each death delivered through poison to match the death that had been inflicted. The campaign continuing for exactly 1 year until every man responsible had paid with his life. A story of livelihood and devastating loss, of patience and righteous fury, of justice found where the law would not provide it, and of a family who proved that some bonds, whether between humans or between humans and the animals they depend upon, are sacred beyond what modern authority can comprehend. The story speaks to questions that have no comfortable answers, questions about the nature of survival and the limits of what any family should be expected to endure. The Ritchie clan killed 21 men, poisoned each one to echo what had been done to Atlas, committed acts that the law must condemn regardless of the circumstances that drove them, but they acted from a place of profound violation, from an attack on their livelihood that went far beyond the killing of a single animal. The federal authorities who might have pursued the case more aggressively eventually recognized the futility of their efforts. The Ritchie clan had demonstrated that certain communities could not be subdued through ordinary means, that the knowledge preserved in mountain families provided protections that even modern law enforcement could not penetrate. The decision to let the matter drop was pragmatic, a recognition that continued investigation would produce nothing except continued frustration. The mountain communities that knew their story and protected them during their campaign understood something that the official world could not comprehend. They understood that Atlas's death was an assault on values they all shared, that the horse represented not just the Ritchie family's livelihood, but a way of life that all of them maintained against the pressures of a modernizing world. They understood that the clan's vengeance was not merely personal, but communal, a defense of traditions that everyone in the Hollows cherished. The descendants of the Ritchie clan continue to farm their land in Knott County, continue to maintain the traditions their ancestors established 6 generations ago. The steep fields that Atlas once plowed have mostly returned to forest, but the family persists, adapting to changing times while preserving the values that have defined them for 2 centuries. The knowledge that made their campaign possible remains, passed down through generations who understand that some things should never be forgotten. The mountains of eastern Kentucky remain much as they were in 1971, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollows that sheltered the Ritchie clan during their campaign still shelter their descendants, people who know the history and who honor the memory. The modern world has encroached somewhat, brought paved roads and cell phone towers to places that once knew only horses and footpaths, but the essential character of the region remains unchanged. A story of a family who lost something essential to their survival through an act of calculated cruelty, who refused to accept that loss as their final word, who proved through terrible means that they possessed knowledge and determination that the modern world had forgotten but could never safely ignore. The mountains remember, and through them, through the songs and stories that continue to be sung and told across eastern Kentucky and beyond, so do we all now and forever, as long as memory endures and people gather to hear tales of families who defended their livelihoods against all those who dared to destroy them.